Chapter 2 is all about quadratics, and we're going to start by solving quadratic equations. The quadratic equation looks very much like the thing you see at the top of your screen. We use a, b, and c to denote the coefficients of x squared, x, and 1. Okay, let's make a start on factorization. The underlying concept of factorization. If we have two numbers, m and n, and they multiply together to equal 0, well, quite quickly I would imagine you'd come to the conclusion either m is the number 0 or n is the number 0. If they're both non-zero, then they can't possibly multiply to make 0, so one of them has to be 0. Now, when we factorise, we are creating two factors, just like m and n. Two things multiply together to make 0. So either this first factor, x minus 1 is 0, or this second factor, x minus 5 is 0. Those are the only two ways we can multiply those two brackets together and make 0. So if we take the x minus 1 equaling to 0, well, that only happens when x equals 1, and x plus 5 only equals 0 only when x equals minus 5. So these values of x are called our solutions. This is the reason why we factorise, so we can make each factor equal 0 in turn and find out what x values that gives. Okay, so we did factorising quadratics in the last chapter. We're just going to refresh that now, but we have this with equal to 0 at the end, and it's going to give us our two factors, but then from there we'll find our two solutions by making each factor equal 0 in turn. So we're going to start off with an example where a is equal to 1. I'm going to be quiet now and let this play out. So those are our two factors, and we have to proceed by making each of those factors equal to 0 and solving the ensuing equation. You will get to a point where you can do that in your head, where you can move the 15 across the equal sign and just write down x is equal to minus 15. So those are our two solutions for our first equation. Again, we have a more difficult version. We've done this in the previous chapter, so I'm going to be quiet and let this play out. You'll notice this is the new method that I probably did introduce to you. I do still really like it, so I am going to be using it. But it doesn't really matter which method you use to get there. You must still end up with the two brackets that I get. And again, it doesn't matter which order those brackets are written down in. The 5 and the 4 both cancel with the 20, leaving us only with those two brackets. So these are what you should have no matter which method you took. And that is equal to 0, which is the extension in chapter 2. We make each bracket equal 0 and we solve. Particularly when there's a number in front of x, like 4 is in this case, or 5, it's worth writing it down and proceeding all the way through your working to get these numbers 3 and 4 or 7 and 5 in the right positions. Okay, not strictly a method, more a way of finishing a problem or finishing a problem that's been given to you half finished. We are just going to try and make x the subject of each of these by square rooting at some stage Now we move the 18 over and square root both sides. We must remember this plus or minus outside the square root. It means that we have two values hidden in that one equation, positive root 18 and negative root 18. For our second example, we can see that single copy of x tied up in the square bracket, which means that we're just going to proceed to unlocking x within that square bracket. It feels a lot like the last part of completing the square, and in reality, that's exactly what it is. We add 3 to both sides, and we must remember the plus or minus when we square root both sides. It's incredibly important, and without it, you miss one of the solutions. So we have 3 plus root 8 and 3 minus root 8. I'm just going to leave them in that unsimplified surd form. For me, it's all about just getting the answer. Simplifying it afterward is one of the final steps you would take for an exam question. The final method we're going to be using in this video is by using the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula is written at the top of the screen, and the first thing we're going to do is pick off A, B and C out of our quadratic equation. We see we have a negative b, which means minus b is a double negative. So I've written the negative b inside brackets. And similarly, this is the number one error when doing this. Minus 15, the b squared turning into minus 15 squared. If you leave those brackets off, you simply get the wrong answer and 0 marks. You must use these brackets in order to square the negative. It brings it out as positive 225. If you don't put that in your calculator, your calculator thinks this is a negative, and that gives you the complete wrong answer. So if you do that, you will not be forgiven. Be aware of the common mistake now, and make sure you practice this with lots of negative b examples to make sure that you've got it. With these, you will commonly be asked to use your calculator to give the answer to a number of significant figures or decimal places. Here I'm giving you both answers to 2dp, 6.32 and negative 1.32. Both of those have been rounded, and they are the solutions to our equation.